Another way of vilifying the Quran sometimes is to say, listen, the situation here is that, for example, you mentioned Surah At-Tawbah, Surah 9 before,
Yes.
which has more violent material. Surah Al-Anfal is another one, Surah 8, that people sometimes bring up.
Yes.
And they would say, well, these verses that have this sort of violent material, or these surahs, these chapters, are by tradition assigned to the Medinan period.
Mm-hmm.
And then in mentioning sort of a friendly, pluralist, or inclusivist verse, one example you gave was Surah Al-Kafirun. You say, well, surahs like that are from the Meccan period. So just
Right.
for our listeners or viewers who may not know all of this, by tradition, the Quranic surahs can be divided between those proclaimed by the Prophet Muhammad between 610 and 622 in Mecca. So these are called Meccan surahs. In those proclaimed by the Prophet Muhammad in Medina between 622 and 632, and those are called, accordingly, Medinan surahs. So anyway, so in sort of problematizing the Quran, people say, yeah, well, the friendly stuff is in Mecca, and then the more violent stuff is in Medina. And so this shows that the Quran sort of moved from openness to being more closed or even hostile to the other. And I mean, some people even say, in trying to vilify the Quran, that this shows a certain opportunism in the Prophet.
Mm-hmm.
He was only open and friendly to the other when he didn't have power and couldn't impose his will. And then suddenly Medina, where he did have power because he was the head of state in Medina, then his real colors showed. So yeah, what do you think about that method, that argument, and all that stuff?
Yeah, I too hear people say that there is a shift in the language of the Quran from openness in the Meccan period to polemics in the Medinan period. As you just mentioned, that the Quran is divided into two parts according to the traditional approach. And at the time when Muhammad was in Mecca, the Quran seemed to be avoiding a kind of any military confrontation. But when Muhammad moved from Mecca to Medina and his followers grow in number and become stronger, then the Quran used more harsh language concerning the other. That's the kind of interpretation that some people think about the development of the Quranic attitude toward the other. There is a book by Reuven Firestone entitled "Jihad: The Origin of Holy War in Islam," which is an excellent book. I love that book, and perhaps one of the best in my view concerning the idea of jihad in Islam, the origin of how the idea developed. And in chapter, in one chapter in that book, he discussed the traditional view of how the Quran treats the other. And according to his discussion, that traditionally Muslims tend to classify the Quranic verse concerning jihad into four categories. The first category is those passages of the Quran that follow under the category of non-confrontation.
Yes.
Avoid any kind of confrontation. And then the second category, I think he called like defensive fighting, meaning you can fight but for self-defense. Okay, and then the third development, he called it like initiating fight is possible, but within ancient stricture. You don't fight in certain place like the haram, or you don't fight during the Ramadan or something like that, right? The holy months. And then the last time is unconditional fight, just fight, like whatever. So from the traditional point of view, these different approaches of the Quran are often understood in terms of the gradual development. This is also the way how those different approaches to the Quran have been understood by traditional Muslims. However, this reading, in my view, is not supported by the text of the Quran itself. Because if we examine the Quran more closely, we will see some overlaps in the language of the Quran. I mean, there is no clear-cut division between the Meccan and the Medinan messages of the Muslim scripture. The Meccan Quran does not necessarily reflect totally polemical, attitude toward non-Muslims, because one of the most cited verses in the Quran that seem to promote a peaceful coexistence can be found in the Meccan, in the Medinan.
In the Medinan. You said Meccan before, but I think you meant Medinan.
Yeah, in the Medinan, in the
Yes.
Medinan chapters. Take the example of, this is the, I mean, I like the whole thing, but I really like this beautiful passage of the Quran, which says in chapter 2, verse 200, so verse 60, I think verse 62, right? Which says, Innal ladina amanu wal ladina hadu wan nasara was sabiin man amana billah, those who believe, Jews, Christians, Sabian, whoever believe in God in the last day and work righteously, they will receive that word from their Lord, and they will not,
no fear upon them.
Fear or not will they grieve. So look at this. Like, this is one of the most inclusivist passages in the Muslim scripture that can be found in the Medinan chapters of the Quran.
And it has a doublet verse, as you know, in Surah 5, which is
exactly
for some the very last surah of the Quran.
Right. This passage of the Quran can is repeated in one of the latest chapters of the Quran. So there are some overlaps. So I think this is one of the the weaknesses of the chronological reading of the Quran, because it tend to ignore the overlap between the Quranic messages.
Yes. Very interesting point. Very interesting point. Right.